Chapter 10. No More Mr. Nice Guy. The dark-robed figure stalked across the hillside, its garments rustling in the night breezes. Ace followed at a distance, the gun tucked into the belt of her robe. She wasn't feeling cold, which was probably something to do with Christopher. They had walked through the camp like it wasn't there, the nervous sentries looking straight past them. It was like a dream, like sleepwalking. Christopher had been silent as he led the way up the hillside. When he reached the white horse, he stopped and turned to look down at the lights of the camp. Ace joined him, watching as two owls swooped above the downlands, hunting. "So," she began, when it became clear that Christopher wasn't going to talk first. "How you doing?" "I am dead," the robed figure rumbled. "I control this body from pewter space, where I live on, having transferred my soul there." He pulled the cowl from his head. Ace was shocked to see the pallor of his skin and the lifeless tilt of his eyes. His lips barely moved, and they were already caked and cracked. Already that life is fading. Soon I shall be gone, and this body will obey the demands of our enemy. "What? Why?" Christopher showed her his palm. Under the skin, a number of the white fibers were moving. "I have walked the camp, taken in as many as I could. They still identify me as a target. Tell me, do you believe in destiny?" Ace sat down in the grass, pulling her robe over her knees. "No. You get the breaks, you make what you can of them." She looked up at Christopher. "Look, the doctor knows a lot about computers. Maybe he could—" My heart had stopped. Christopher's dead eyes swept over the landscape. "And the only electrical activity in my brain is that which I create there. There are no options left for me. Sometimes the paths to be taken are obvious. If you stay here, stay with Ramini Pashi—" "Aradrath," Ace corrected him, and then gasped. "Hey, look, did you know that too?" "Yes." Christopher looked away quickly. "But I have known him too long to be used to it. If you stay with him, then you will have to make a sacrifice." "Why's everybody telling me that? What's wrong with living happily ever after, anyway?" Ace rubbed her brow, wondering why she had come out with Jen's name like that. It was precious to her, something wonderful. Although she trusted Christopher, it was as if the magic of this encounter had eased the word out of her brain. Christopher's cracked lips smiled as he looked down at her confusion. "It is a dream, a good dream, but death will end it, sooner or later. You are the best beloved of time, the steward to the doctor, who calls himself Time's champion. But time is the lover of change. Soon, nothing will be the same." "How do you know all this?" "I am part of everything now. I wonder if dying in the Matrix will be like dying at all. But then, I don't know what dying is like." He put a hand to Ace's head. "Do not trust those with the spores on them." Then he turned and began to walk down the hill. Ace watched him go, distractedly hitting the earth with her hand. "I don't care about destiny," she whispered. "Don't care about anything but him." Benny led the doctor to a line of low pylons that stretched across a hillside. A wire hummed between the pylons, and small lights blinked on top of them. They left the horses tethered to a tree, and walked the quarter-mile to the fence. "This is the edge of the current landing zone," Benny pointed. "These barriers are designed to keep herd animals out. What about people? There's precious little chance of anybody getting hit by one of the pods, and there's too big an area to guard. Besides, if you knew that several tons of dead people were about to descend pretty rapidly overhead, would you go wandering around sightseeing? I think not." "No." The doctor ducked under the fence. "Coming?" Benny nodded. "We've got 6 hours until the next drop time. Will that do?" "Oh, yes." The doctor raised the wire with his umbrella. "I'm only sightseeing." They trudged down into the valley. Bernice looked at the doctor occasionally as they went. "So," she asked, "do you have a girlfriend?" "No." "Boyfriend?" "No." "On a railway set?" "Somewhere." The doctor was staring down into the valley, observing the fiery shapes that lay there. "The TARDIS is full of surprises. But you're not the sort of person that keeps a big table with tiny trees and signal boxes and things." "No." "Ah, then you must be interested in law and order." The doctor stopped and turned to face Bernice. "No," he said, a slow grin spreading over his features. "I like chaos. Big explosions, rebellions, that sort of thing." "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to know why you go around in a police box." "You know what one is?" "It's from my favorite era." "I could have changed it ages ago," the doctor confided. "But I like the shape and the motto. Call here for help. That's what I do. I let little children sleep safely at night, because I've searched through all the shadows and chased the baddies away. I'm what monsters have nightmares about." He sounded quite satisfied with that for a moment, and Bernice smiled. But, as they approached the fires that guttered and flared in the valley, She could see from his face that he wasn't content with his definition of himself. "But everybody's a monster sometimes." The doctor picked his way through the great impact craters that had been blasted into the grasslands. He bent down to watch a mole trying to rebuild its home. "We all do things we regret, and sometimes we have to lose things very precious to us." He stood again suddenly and looked around. "Are these craters formed where the pods have landed?" "Yes." Benny led the way down into a crater, slipping on the smooth earthen walls. At the bottom of the hole, plowed into the earth, lay a sizzling black pod, about the size of a coffin. Deposits on its surface were still burning. "Remains of a sash," Benny explained. "This one would have been a corporate soldier. Can't tell which company now. In the morning, robot gardeners buzz the area and plow everything under. The caskets are made of hard cellulose, so they're biodegradable. Do all the dead arrive on heaven like this? No. The majority are shipped in and given a traditional burial. The bones are miles thick in some areas. There are a great many corpses in Draconian and human space, and loads of them end up here. Several alien species are convinced the place is sacred as well. They would be. The computer records have been interfered with for centuries. Everybody's been conned into sending their dead here. Why? Open the casket." Benny shrugged. "If I was a religious person, I'd find the idea very distasteful, but I'm a tomb robber, so here we go." She removed a device from her belt and ran it along the seam of the casket. The doctor lifted the lid and peered inside. He knelt and pulled a skull out, turning it over in his hand. "Do you think we should take arms against a sea of troubles?" he asked the skull. "Mixed metaphor," sighed Benny. "Deliberately." The doctor upturned the skull. A host of white filaments dropped onto the soil and swiftly began to bury their way in. "You can't fight the sea, no matter what you do." Ace watched the owls circling above the forest as she trudged back to camp. Dawn was breaking over the hills. It felt like the last dawn ever, cold and a bit half-hearted. The travelers were packing their tents away, folding them up into boxes, which were then slung over the backs of horses. They left white circles on the ground where they'd restricted the growth of grass. Moira was walking from stone to stone around the circle, touching each one as if to say goodbye. Jan shouted and ran forward, lifting Ace up in a whirling hug. "Where were you?" he laughed. "I thought you'd left me." "Never." Ace kissed him soundly, wondering whether she should tell him about Christopher. "I went up to the hill, to think a bit. After last night? Gods, you're a warrior, aren't you?" "Yeah. What's going on? Why's everybody leaving?" "We're moving on. The decision was made around the fire this morning. We'd searched the camp for any fibers, and didn't find many, but the site's not really safe anymore. Roche has been trying to remove the threats from the people who got touched. We think there's 3 of them. She argued that we should move right off planet, but Moira brought it down to just getting a little nearer civilization. We're going towards Joycetown. That'll take us near Benny's dig." "Aye, that's where we're stopping. Safety in numbers." "Hey, you said us." "So I did." Ace kissed him again. They wandered back to Jan's tent, or what remained of it. The central pole had been removed, and piles of cutlery, fabrics, and tools were stacked outside of it. Ace piled in, placing things carefully in the wooden trunks. She pulled the goblet from a silk scarf and examined the carving on the golden stem. "This is the one you're worried about, right? The one you got from the vacuum church?" "That's the one." Ace's finger found the hollow of the base. "This must be really valuable." "It might be, but that's where Roche is wrong, you see. I wouldn't do anything for money." His tone was irritated, and Ace remembered how sensitive he was about the cup. "It's good that you've got it," she said. "Even if it was filled with blood and the dreaming, they don't deserve—" The goblet had suddenly got deeper. A false bottom in the cup had vanished when she put her finger into the base. "Here, have you seen this?" Jan looked over her shoulder. "No," he whispered. "That's going to be for poison or something, isn't it?" "Well, it's empty now." Ace dropped the goblet into the case. "Maybe that's the secret of the goblet," she told Jan. "Maybe Vic will stop bothering you about it now." "I doubt it," Jan smiled, returning to his packing. On a distant hillside many hours later, as Christopher's body walked to wherever it was going, it passed the doctor. The doctor was staring down at the camp also, his eyes fixed on Jan's tent. He seemed to be fighting something inside himself, his eyes dark. Christopher paused and looked at him coldly. "Aradrath," he spat. The doctor glowered back. "Yes," was all he said. Then both resumed the paths they had been walking. Phaedrus looked around his congregation, nodding eagerly. "We are pawns," he told them. "We are only soldiers, dying for futility. We are used by our masters, as others are. Our only boon is that we know. We are allowed to see." "Are the new acolytes ready?" 2 young men and an old woman stepped forward. They were dressed in gray robes. The woman was dying, as converts often were. She'd read one of the church's books on making more of your passing, and had spent 3 weeks being counseled by Phaedrus himself. One of the boys was a runaway, an apprentice farmhand. He probably thought that this was a good gang to belong to, the ultimate way to display your individuality. The last boy had not offered any reasons. He'd only insisted. Normally, they'd have had more time. Ah well, things were hard for everybody. "Bring the worms," Phaedrus commanded. An acolyte stepped forward, carrying 3 white fibers on the end of a baton. He showed the initiates the creatures. "If you wish, you may go in peace," Phaedrus told them. "But, if you wish to die alive, and be whole in the knowledge of your death, then seize the worm." The old woman already had, watching it squirm on the surface of her palm, working its way under her skin. The runaway closed his eyes and touched the fiber with the back of his hand, wincing. The other boy stared at the baton. He reached his hand out, shaking. Phaedrus watched, interested. He lived for these moments. The boy smacked the baton aside and ran, shoving guards out of the way. Phaedrus inclined his head to the 2 new acolytes. "Welcome," he said. "Your comrade may have run away, but he will be with us soon enough. Now, we all have a task to perform." The doctor was lying on the floor, a notepad in hand, glancing between the papers of Felsicar and the base of the telescope. He made a final note, read back what he had written, and then jumped up. Benny was leaning in the doorway, her arms folded. She'd caught 3 hours' sleep, and was feeling a strong urge to resort to makeup to hide the bags under her eyes. "Eureka?" she asked. "Yes." The doctor stuffed his hat back on his head and pointed to the ceiling. "The observatory used to be at ground level. In the last few decades, the Earth subsided." Yes, Benny stopped him. "I know. The art is much bigger than what we see on the surface. So we must dig it out." The doctor was flustered, pacing back and forth. "No problem. The crew still owe me a day's work." Benny put a hand on the doctor's shoulder. "Look, digging it straight out will ruin anything we might find in the infill. It's against my code of ethics." She paused. "When you said last night that the mixed metaphor in Hamlet was deliberate, was that a critical opinion or first-hand knowledge?" "I was there when Will composed it," the doctor snapped. "I was a friend of his, and, when I'm not dealing with threats to life and liberty, I spend most of my time correcting idiots who misquote him." Benny narrowed her eyes, staring keenly at the doctor's expression. He was completely sincere. "This is my career we're talking about. My whole life. Tell me it's vital. Do it in an hour, and I might not have to do something I'll regret. Please. It's important." 1 hour. Benny nodded, sighed, and ran to tell her crew. She slapped Ace on the shoulder as they passed in the earthen corridor. "I've just decided," she shouted. "What?" Ace called after her. "I'm not an archaeologist!" Benny vanished around the corner. Operative Miller hit the button angrily. "Damn it, Judith," he muttered. "Why can't we communicate with them?" Judith, the communications officer at Miller's base, shook her head. "The main antenna of the orbital platform has been rerouted, as we knew it would be, in order to monitor ground-based sources. Any evidence that Kale is actually doing that? The emission spectrum from the platform would suggest not. We could work out the angle of the antenna." Fiona touched a control. "It's pointed straight at Joycetown. Hasn't moved in 3 hours, and the secondary antenna's out. So, what's going on up there?" Miller looked at the ceiling in frustration. Suddenly, a red light appeared on the desk. "Platform engines just fired, sir," Fiona shouted. "Sustained burst." "What?" Miller jumped into a chair and checked the instruments. "My God," he whispered. "They're on a re-entry curve." Ace popped her head around the door of the observatory and whistled to the doctor. "How's it going?" "Terrible," the doctor growled. Ace stepped back a little, and he softened, reaching out to smooth her hair. "How are the travelers?" "Come and see for yourself." Ace led him out into the sunlight. The travelers were setting up camp all around the dig site. On the back of a cart stood the TARDIS. "Thought we'd better bring it with us," Ace smiled, taking the doctor's arm. "Good." The doctor had grinned at the sight, and Ace was full of things she wanted to say to him. "I'm in love," she wanted to say. "Come to the wedding." "Ah, you found another man already." Jan slapped the doctor on the back. Ace sighed. The doctor was looking tense again. It was as if Jan made him nervous. Benny had taken up a pick and was hacking at the soft soil under the arch. Her students were clustered around her, helping out with spades and starting up power tools. "Hoy!" she shouted, catching sight of Jan. "Get your people over here and help us finish off a promising career, you lazy git!" The three creatures stepped forward and bowed to Kale, the tendrils of their heads quivering. The remnants of corporate uniforms still clung to their fungoid bodies. Kale smiled. The tentacles that had unfurled from his arm socket were holding down 3 of the rocket thrust controls. He turned his head to the viewing port and saw the globe of heaven growing gradually larger. The first flickers of outer atmosphere were already burning blue and red as they caught the external struts of the platform. Kale licked his lips, suppressing a spasm of fear. He concentrated on the music that was soaring up from the planet, roaring into the antenna, directing every subtle movement of his tentacles on the thrust controls. The music was gradually increasing in volume. Rosha heard the sound first. From the tents of the archaeologist was coming a steady beeping noise. She glanced at the large team of travelers and students digging away under the arch. Kathleen was singing a rhythmic song as he shoveled aside great clods of mud, and Moira had picked up on it too. Dear Moira. Rosha hoped that, somewhere in the future, she'd forgive her for what she'd done. She opened the flap of the tent and picked up the receiver of Benny's radio unit, reciting the call sign off the top of the pack. "This is Miller," a voice cut in, sounding desperate. "You must all get away from there as soon as possible. The orbital platform is in a declining orbit. We've worked out that it will crash in your area. You must get away. Hello? Are you there?" Rosha lowered the receiver, shaking. A burning pain was coming from her foot. "What should I do?" she whispered. "Who will save us now?" A hand reached out and took the receiver. The doctor glared at the traveler, his eyes full of steel. "I will," he growled. Phaedrus and his congregation were singing, an incredibly complex melody, the vocal patterns interlacing in delicate strands. They had their eyes closed, and their thoughts were all the same. Computations of falling spacecraft, visions of paths and vectors. They had been rehearsing this for months. The new intake trained in it as part of their instruction. The song resounded through the architecture, echoing and spiraling off of the walls of the temple. It concealed another sound from an anteroom, a wheezing, groaning sound. Ace and Benny hopped up on the lectern at one end of the temple, in front of the choir. Guards snatched for their guns, but Ace pulled 2 submachine guns and waved them randomly at the crowd, grinning. Benny aimed down her pistol, straight at Phaedrus' head. Phaedrus kept singing, his eyes fixed on the weapon. With an effort of will, he closed his eyes. The guards lowered their weapons. Benny cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called, shouting over the choir, "I'd like to introduce you to possibly the most important thing on this side of the universe. Let's have a big hand for the Doctor!" The congregation still had their eyes clenched tightly closed, still holding on to the song. They couldn't afford to lose concentration for a second. Phaedrus' brow was sweating as he held the singers together, coordinating the signal as they were physically beaming into space. It was working. The platform was following the right arc, making tiny course corrections as it fell. But then, another voice joined in the chorus, and it was singing a different tune. The song told the congregation that she might have been weary, that they knew how girls got weary, wearing that same old dress. The doctor was crooning into a stand-up microphone, speakers in the TARDIS throwing his voice into the massed choir. Benny leaned over the mic, hollering the lyrics of the chorus in a voice with more soul than training. Ace shrugged at the guards. "Not my style," she mouthed. The choir's melody began to break up as the other song entwined with it. The acolytes opened their eyes and looked round, trying to find their place in the tune again. Phaedrus clenched his hands in rage, his nails biting into his palms. He could still see it. It was still there. It was gone. "What are you doing?" he bellowed. The choir stopped suddenly, and so did the doctor. The Time Lord leapt off the stage and grabbed Phaedrus by the collar. "Winning," he snarled. "Now let me talk to your masters!" A limb cracked from the platform and spun away as the spacecraft tumbled into the atmosphere, clouds rushing up to meet it. The exterior was already becoming molten, goblets of metal spraying off into the void as a blast of friction fried the surface. Kale had lost the song and was screaming now, his teeth clenched. The 3 monsters behind him were becoming feathery, their skins erupting into masses of white fiber. He was nearly there. He had been on the right course. He could feel it. If he could hold on for just a few more seconds. Moira stared up at the glow that was blooming over the western horizon. The travelers had gathered in a crowd and were sheltering each other. Winds were beginning to whip across the planet's surface, faster and faster. The archaeology students had grabbed horses and had been going to gallop away as fast as they could. Moira had told them that it wouldn't be fast enough. The platform would hit the planet like an atomic bomb. Some had gone anyway. Those that remained grasped the hands of the travelers and looked up into the sky. Moira had told them the travelers didn't die with their eyes closed. Jan gritted his teeth. He and Moira and Rosha had formed a line at the front of the group, holding hands. Ace got away, at least. Rosha smiled at him. I love you. I love you, Jan whispered back, without hesitation. We're all going to the goddess together, Moira told Rosha. I'll love you better next time. I hope you get the chance. Rosha's voice broke, and she began to sob. But anyway, any way you like is fine. You just find me. Whatever I am, a dog, a bloody snail, I'll take care of you in the next life. Come on, then, Jan shouted to the sky. The travelers took up the cry, a scream to the goddess of poetry and war. The glow filled half the sky. I don't need you, the doctor slapped Phaedrus across the face. You're a puppet. Give me your masters. Phaedrus flushed with anger. Then he gasped as his head jerked back. A different voice gurgled from his throat. His eyes stared upwards, lifelessly.
So, Time Lord, what do you want of us?
Destroy the platform.
Why?
You need a pawn here. I know that. You need a powerful host mind to be able to broadcast your signal. For the moment, you need Phaedrus. Are you sure my song was random? Are you sure I haven't set the platform into a new trajectory? Perhaps to land here? The voice broke into a hissing laugh.
We know you, Time's champion. You will not take life.
I will.
Ace ran forward and shoved one of her SMGs into Phaedrus' throat. If it's Jan's or you, you're dead, so back off or I'll blow his brains out. You know I will. Benny winced at what she heard in Ace's voice. He was on the edge of hysteria. The doctor folded his hands behind his back.
I'll leave her to it then,
he murmured. A low hiss escaped Phaedrus' throat. Kale was laughing now, as heaven swept up towards him. He was going to achieve his great mission for the cause of death. He could see mountains and hills and rivers, and one of his tentacles jerked against a red switch. The platform exploded into a ball of flaming gas. The explosion lit up the sky above the dig, coloring the clouds. A moment later, a thunderclap echoed off the hills and dells. 1,000 daylight meteors burst across the blue, trailing fire and smoke, and the travelers fell to their knees in relief. Doctor, whispered Moira. Thank you. Don't cut it so bloody fine next time, muttered Jan. Phaedrus awoke to Ace grinning at him. Love does strange things to you, she said.
And nearly to you, the doctor let go of the priest. Tell your masters that if they leave now, I may choose not to harm them. Now, do we get out of here unmolested, or do the pawns have ideas above their station?
Phaedrus didn't speak. He just raised an open palm. He was looking at Ace with a kind of longing. It took a moment before Ace realized that he was actually looking at her gun. The three champions dashed back to the TARDIS. At the last moment, Benny peeped back around the corner, to the anteroom. But apart from all that, she asked, what did you think of the song? A red umbrella handle pulled her off into the TARDIS.